I'm your host, Michael Callahan. This is Where We Go Next. And since the summer of 2020, many of us have had productive, needed conversations on race and identity with our friends, family, and coworkers. But looking back, at the national level at least, we also had a lot of pretty bad ones. They were often simplistic, reductive, censorious, and even pretty racist. So how do we talk about such an important, often divisive topic without descending into stereotype and resentment? Our guest this week is a leading expert on diversity, equity, and inclusion training that teaches people how to be in relationship with others and themselves. Chloé Valdary is an American writer and entrepreneur whose company, Theory of Enchantment, teaches social and emotional learning in schools and diversity and inclusion in companies and government agencies. Chloé, thanks so much for joining us again.
Thank you for inviting me.
It is always such a pleasure to have you. Now, last we spoke in January of 2021, I feel like American society was experiencing a sort of collective fever or psychosis around the issues of race and identity. There were a lot of good conversations happening. I think you were having quite a few of them. But there was also, it felt at times, a lot of, for lack of a better word, just sheer insanity. Like I remember Race to Dinner, in which affluent white women would sign up for dinners where they would be berated for how racist they were. And diversity, equity, and inclusion institutionally was pretty much everywhere, and a very specific ideological, often antagonistic version of it. Mandatory DEI statements in hiring within academia, often acting as ideological purity tests, and online DEI training sessions at Coca-Cola, imploring employees to, quote, be less white, because to be less white was to, quote, be less oppressive, be less arrogant, be less ignorant. Now it appears to be in retreat, or at least remission. Harvard's Faculty of Arts and Sciences, as of this month, no longer requires diversity statements from job applicants. MIT made a similar move in May. So my first question is, are we experiencing an actual sea change in how we think about these topics, or is it a shuffling of chairs to make it seem like there's a change?
Well, we're definitely experiencing something. Time will tell what it actually ends up being. And of course, it is up to us to make it whatever we want it to be. There's certainly been a backlash to DEI. I don't know that that backlash is as wise as I would like it to be. And obviously, I am responding to instances where states have made DEI illegal. Utah is one of those states, I believe. Texas is another one. This is ironic to me because it's an attempt to ban something. And the attempt to ban something cannot actually expunge the human impulse to, let's say, become dogmatic or to engage in these purification tests that you have described in order to create an environment and an ecosystem where we move away from that and we move towards, let's say, institutions that flourish, whether those institutions are tasked with higher learning or those institutions are in the corporate space, tasked with creating products and services. You actually have to create behaviors, or you have to cultivate an environment where certain pro-social behaviors are incentivized, and simply banning things does not produce that. And it is ironic to me personally, especially as an entrepreneur who is, invested in building my company Theory of Enchantment, that certain people who are in the entrepreneurial space, namely Elon Musk and others, are taking a banning approach as opposed to asking themselves, well, how can we build something better? And of course, in 2020, Theory of Enchantment, myself personally, we predicted the backlash in the sense that we predicted that DEI as it was being presented would not work because it was not rooted in a Kingian, aka Dr. King style approach. It was rooted in a very punitive approach, which is ironic because some of the people who were promoting it also, if you were to ask them about criminal justice reform, if you were to ask them about restorative justice, if you were to ask them about the criminal justice system, they would actually argue that it's too punitive and needs to be restorative. But those same people took a punitive approach when it came to the racial reckoning. So time will tell what we end up creating collectively as a country, as a nation. And obviously, there's a lot that comes out of the American psyche in terms of how much we export our ideas to the rest of the globe. So we will see what happens.
It feels like it's impossible to have nuanced conversations about the most important topics in society, at least at a national level. Like I remember 20 years ago, maybe 25 years ago, just as I was coming of age, hearing politicians during the election year talking about how someone was soft on crime if they didn't believe in, let's say, like the three strikes law, right? Like, oh, if you weren't for someone going to prison for the rest of their life after their third offense, then you were soft on crime, right? And so it became this either or scenario, which even back then at like 16, 17 years old, I was like, this is really reductive and doesn't actually get to the core of the issue, which is how do we actually reduce crime? How do we make communities safer? How do we lessen recidivism? How do we rehabilitate the people who can be rehabilitated, which I think is most people? Just as a hypothetical, like if 50% of all children were malnourished for some awful reason, and someone came out and said, you know what, as a solution to this, we're going to give all of these malnourished children turkey sandwiches. And then someone else came out and said, well, I actually think turkey sandwiches are a bad idea because some of these children might be vegetarian and some of them might be allergic to grain. So we shouldn't give them turkey sandwiches. And then the entire conversation is about whether or not we should give children turkey sandwiches. And the actual root of the conversation, there are starving children, gets set to the side. And I feel like when we're talking about issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion, or what to teach in history books, or whether to ban or not ban certain things, we're not ever actually talking about the root of the issue, which is what is racism? What is race? How are these things manifesting in society today? How can we deconstruct them? Should we deconstruct them? The actual core issue itself. But instead, we're going back and forth like a tough on crime approach or giving turkey sandwiches to starving children approach of it's either all of A or all of B. But there's a symphony, a chorus of different things we could be talking about within this conversation that we're just simply not doing.
Yeah, there's no like design thinking brought to the conversation at all. And quite frankly, I was not trained in design thinking until I started a company and ended up partnering with my business partner who comes from that background. And I think it's something that should be taught in schools. But yeah, there's no like design thinking in terms of this is the problem that we want to solve for. How do we talk to the people who are closest to the problem? Because the people who are closest to the problem are often closest to the solution. How might we survey those people? How might we build products and services and then survey those people who receive those products and services to iterate on the products and services that we just created so that they can get better and get better at meeting the needs of the people we're serving? Like there's none of that paradigm. That paradigm does not exist in the conversations that we're having today.
Why not? Why are companies like Apple and Microsoft and Tesla, why are major corporations better at talking about design thinking when it comes to designing products and how they service customers? But we seem incapable of having these conversations around, I would say, far more important issues.
You know, I don't think we as a society are exposed to design thinking. Like I said, I would hope that this would be taught in schools because I wasn't exposed to it until after my formal education. But I also think we are a deeply Puritan nation. And so all the things that you described at the beginning, the purity tests, the EI statements, pressure to conform in very specific ways are, in a way, very deeply American. So you'll hear conservatives sort of gripe at this or protest, but it's like, no, this is very deeply American. It's very uniquely American. This is what our forefathers and mothers, if you will, brought with them as they were trying to escape persecution from England. So all this is built into the psyche, into the consciousness of what it means to be an American. And as long as we remain unaware of this fact, we will continue to show up unconsciously projecting all of these things at each other and not transitioning to a more design thinking style of being and problem solving.
Echoes of the Salem witch trials and the Scarlet Letter, for sure.
Oh, yeah.
We cannot escape the past. I'm just going to ask this out of nowhere, but I think it's important to ask because I know that Coleman Hughes is talking about this a lot. I think it's important to discuss. I think it's a word that often gets misused, I think intentionally by bad actors. In your opinion, is being colorblind racist?
No, being colorblind is not racist, although I will say that insofar as Coleman's TED Talk and subsequent book is concerned, I find it interesting that Coleman was really arguing for equity based on class. That's the actual thing he was arguing for. And I think it's unfortunate that the conversation became about the sort of like colorblinded. Like what he's actually arguing for is that there should be redistribution of wealth, which is quite something to argue at a TED conference. If you consider the socioeconomic status of maybe it's not quite the majority of people who attend TED, certainly it's the majority of people who give to TED and make TED possible. And I think that the whole conversation about colorblindness or the focus on the term colorblindness is a distraction from the actual substance of what he was arguing. Now, that's in part our fault as a society, but it is also in part, dare I say it, Coleman's fault for naming his book that. It's sort of an emphasis on we're not trying to be racist instead of emphasizing what we're trying to be or what the projects we're trying to initiate. At least that's my read of the talk and certainly of the book, is that we need to be focusing on wealth. Again, my sense is that as long as we continue the conversation about what does it mean to be colorblind and like, what does it mean to not see color? What he's actually arguing is that what you should be seeing is wealth. But unfortunately, that gets obscured because we're just debating about should we see color? Should we not see color? It sort of like misses the forest for the trees.
Turkey sandwiches for starving children.
Yeah.
It's the same exact conversation over and over again. Should we just ditch certain words and phrases because they're so weighted and we get bogged down by trying to align on a shared description of them? Like the word colorblind, right? Like it triggers people in such a way where even if you try and say, well, by colorblind, I mean XYZ, people who understand colorblind as ABC will never agree to your definition because the other definition is ingrained in them. I think similarly, and this kind of ties into your work with Theory of Enchantment, which does diversity training for small businesses and corporations. Should we ditch diversity, equity, and inclusion as a phrase? Because it feels, as it's used today, like just a collection of tautologies and unfalsifiable statements like diversity is our strength, but we never exactly say why. It feels more like, and as someone who grew up religious as well, Chloe, I'm sure you relate to this, it feels like a religious statement, like God is good or whatever, you know, and no disrespect to people who are religious, right? But it kind of presents itself as this truth. And if you try and dig underneath it, you're seen as a sort of heretic, even if the statement itself makes no sense.
Yeah. So I have mixed opinions on this question. On the one hand, I'm like, sure, we can totally dispense with the terminology, but dispensing with the terminology will not magically make us produce or come up with what we actually mean when we say diversity. I get that the term triggers people with good reason. I get that the phrase is sort of loaded right now. There's a lot of baggage, and I personally have no problem switching or replacing those words with other words, but that doesn't solve for the fact that it's a very poor track record in terms of expecting people to seriously wrestle with what the words mean and to develop a relationship with the words themselves. We will continue to come up against this as an issue unless we dig deeper collectively as a society. And on the other hand, the reason why I am a fan of specifically the word diversity, we have a bunch of documents that expound upon what we mean by diversity. But I actually want to bring up this quote from Steve Jobs that I think really gets to the heart of why diversity matters. Steve Jobs was being interviewed, I believe, on 60 Minutes about how hard it is to design products and services that, let's say, move the world forward. And he says the following about John Scully, who was on his team. He says, one of the things that really hurt Apple was that after I left, John Scully got a very serious disease. And that disease, I've seen other people get it too. It's the disease of thinking that a really great idea is 90% of the work. And that if you just tell these other people, here's this great idea, then of course they can go off and make it happen. And the problem with that is that there's a tremendous amount of craftsmanship in between a great idea and a great product. And as you evolve that great idea, it changes and grows. It never comes out like it starts, because you learn a lot more as you get into the subtleties of it. And you also find that there's tremendous trade-offs that you have to make. There are just certain things you can't make electrons do. There are certain things you can't make plastic do, or glass do, or factories do, or robots do. And as you get into all these things, designing a product is keeping 5,000 things in your brain, these concepts, and fitting them all together and kind of continuing to push and put them together in new and different ways to get what you want. And every day you discover something new, that it is a new problem or new opportunity to fit these things together a little differently. And it's that process that is the magic. Now, I think that is such a profound statement, not only about the process by which robust, innovative products and services are created, but the process through which the project of America is created. Because the motto, the aim, the goal of America is e pluribus unum, out of many one. America is a giant diversity project, you might say. It is asking this very interesting question of how do you bring together people of different backgrounds, of different ethnicities, of different religions, of different creeds, and come together to create a single identity. That is actually incredibly hard, but it's also an incredibly, in my opinion, fun and worthwhile project, because you're asking, how can we actually create a rich, diverse ecosystem that brings about human flourishing? And if that was what people meant when they said diversity, I can get behind that. And that still very much matters. My fear is that like by dispensing with the word or by getting rid of the word, we will lose out on that vision. And that's an incredible vision that I think more of us should be dedicating ourselves to bringing into being.
I completely agree. And you'll never go wrong with a Steve Jobs quote, in my view. Big fan. The big problem that I have with the word diversity as it is employed today is that the use of it in and of itself is still rooted in supremacist thinking. And what I mean by that is, to kind of echo your point, America has always been diverse. The lie has been that it has never been, or it has been very rarely diverse. That's a white supremacist lie. The idea that all of these different European heritages, whether it's Irish, Swedish, English, German, Spanish, French, et cetera, even if the immigrants that were able to come into America pre-1965 were limited to mostly European backgrounds, the lie is that all of those many dozens of cultures together were themselves not diverse. And when we talk about diversity today, as it only applies to racial categorization, in my view, we are furthering the project of racial supremacy and white supremacy by echoing the sentiments of white supremacists 100 years ago. My mom's Armenian, my dad is Irish. And one of my big reasons for starting this podcast was that from about 2013 to 2018, I spent a lot of time, due to an intimate relationship that I was in critical race theory circles. I was introduced to critical race theory in 2013. And one thing that kept getting brought up when I would go to these social events, people would have just met me and they would bring up my Armenian identity as if it was the most important thing about me. It was dehumanizing in a way because it didn't see me as fully myself. And the fact that my Armenian relatives came over here 100 years ago, and I am probably almost no more culturally Armenian than you are at this point, Chloe, except I might like hummus a little bit more than you do. It felt weird to be categorized, and people would say it like proudly to me, as if they were flattering me when they would tell me how important my Armenian identity was. They would never mention my Irish identity, screw my father, but they kept bringing it up over and over again. And I think for my part, and I'd love to throw it back to you, for my part, the way that we truly celebrate diversity is recognizing that while imperfect, America has always been diverse and continues to be. And that my family of Irish and Armenian ancestry is just as diverse as someone who is 1/3 Italian, 1/3 German, 1/3 Scottish, or someone who is half Indian, half Korean. All of these things are equally diverse and equally valuable. And if we dilute it only to racial categorizations, we continue the supremacist project.
Yes, I agree with all of that. One of my favorite fun facts is when Christopher Columbus Day happens these days, people change it to Indigenous Peoples Day, which I think there's a reasonable rationale for that. But what most people don't understand is that Christopher Columbus Day was actually in response to a lynching that happened in New Orleans of Italians.
The largest lynching in American history.
Right? Because Italians were not perceived as white. And this is sort of like one of those really cool moments of paradox where something that has come to be understood as a example of white supremacy was actually in response to white supremacy.
Right.
So it just speaks to that complexity and the true diversity that you're articulating that most of us are not aware of. And I will say, though, that there is a kind of neurobiological component to this piece, which is that the brain is designed to, move away from things that are complex and towards things that are simple. At least the reptilian part of our brains is designed to do that. And our prefrontal cortex helps us slow things down and engage more complexity and take in more complexity. And so on the one hand, I could be like, oh, this is outrageous. Like, why aren't we able to handle complexity? On the other hand, it's like, well, our wiring is actually set up so that it takes quite a lot of work to engage people, to slow down that limbic system way of thinking, to allow the prefrontal cortex to work its magic. There's a lot of humility in recognizing that and realizing that. All of which is to say, if you rewind back to 2020, and it matters that all of this came out of 2020, because it matters that all of this came out in an environment and an ecosystem where we were dealing with COVID-19, we were isolated, we were feeling disconnected, right? We're feeling and experiencing a pain point of scarcity. And human beings, when we don't know how to holistically deal with scarcity, we simplify by taking on easy heuristics that paint the world in black and white. You look like me, you're good. You don't look like me, you're bad. You think like me, you're good. You don't think like me, you're bad. Right? This is a way that we deal with scarcity. Now, it's not helpful. It actually creates more problems than it solves. And we're seeing that still to this day. But it actually somewhat provides me with comfort in knowing that everything is happening the way it happens, like naturally, right?
Almost predictably, yeah.
Right. And there are tools, resources, skill sets that we can develop, practices, modalities that we can engage to help us move to that more desired state where we are able to accept and engage with our full complexity, our own full diversity, so that we can welcome diversity in the other. But that just takes time. And again, there's a lot of humility in recognizing that. There's also a lot of hope in recognizing that.
You've said, and this is echoed on the Theory of Enchantment website, that racial supremacy is rooted in psychological insecurity. Can you say more about that?
So this is something that comes from many of those who marched in the civil rights movement, the greatest protest movement in the history of the United States. Writers like, James Baldwin and certainly Dr. King. But I want to focus on James Baldwin in particular because he really was able to articulate these insights through the written word and the spoken word in a lot of what he produced. He famously had a debate with William F. Buckley in the UK at Oxford where he argued, and this is a radical statement to say, even today in 2024, he says that imagine a racist sheriff in the South who, he says, is ostensibly a man like me who loves his wife and loves to get drunk from time to time, but doesn't know why he takes his pistol and uses it to harm another human being or to brandish another human being because of her skin color. And I'm paraphrasing here. And then he says, what happens to the woman that he abuses is terrible. It's ghastly, he says. What happens to the man who does it is in a way far worse. Now, that is a radical statement because we have come to think of this since 2020, at least, as, very simple oppressor-oppressed binary. If you are engaging in supremacist tendencies against another group of people, you are the oppressor. And if you are the victim of that, you are oppressed. But Baldwin essentially blows up that entire paradigm in that statement because what he's saying is that one must recognize that the quote-unquote oppressor is also suffering, is also a victim of his own ideology, a prisoner of his own ideology, which constrains him or restricts him from being able to be in touch with the inherent beauty of the world. And that is a type of prison, that is a type of hell that in a way is far worse. And this is almost like a very Zen Buddhist take, actually. A kind of assessment or analysis that's rooted in like karma, other Eastern wisdom, perceptions of reality. And it is no coincidence that Dr. King, in as much as he was a student of Protestant theology, he was also a student of Gandhi, right? He was also a student of Eastern mysticism, and the man that he nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize was a Buddhist monk named Thich Nhat Hanh. All of which is to say, you can see this in the science as well. Supremacy is a response to insecurity. The reason why I would feel the need to tear another person down is because I don't feel good about myself. Because if I feel good about myself, I will need to tear another person down in order to feel good, right? So one has to understand that supremacy is the overcompensation. So take the example of Arno Michaelis, right? Arno Michaelis, former white nationalist, now works to help get people out of extremist ideologies. Why did Arno Michaelis become a white nationalist in the first place? He was born into a place of scarcity. He was born into an alcoholic family. His parents were alcoholics. So already you're talking about a child who was born into an ecosystem of scarcity and insecurity. He didn't have the tools to deal with that insecurity and those pain points holistically. So what did he do? He defaulted to something that humans do, which is to see the world in black and white. Now, the way it manifested for him was very particular. The way it manifested for him was all the people who look like me are good and all the people who don't look like me are bad. This is a heuristic that his brain leapt to as a way to deal with the chaos that was going on in his world. James Baldwin said that the reason why we cling to our hatred and our bigotries is because we suspect that once hatred is gone, we will be forced to deal with pain. What Baldwin is saying in that statement is that we actually use hatred as a coping mechanism to deal with pain. The same way we reach for alcohol addiction to deal with pain, the same way we reach for opioid or hard drug addiction to deal with pain, we reach for hatred. Hatred is a coping mechanism. Hatred is not some mysterious thing. It is a coping mechanism that we use to discharge pain. And that's what's going on in supremacy. Obviously hard to see that because pain that the supremacist inflicts upon entire groups of people is also suffering, right? And so we must ask ourselves the question, how can we respond collectively, societally, and individually in ways that tackle the pain point without further perpetuating the ecosystem that produced that in the first place? It's a very species-wide analysis, I would say, that the theory of enchantment tries to give. Like, people say that the 2020 version of DEI is a systemic level analysis, but it actually isn't. To go to the deep root, and that's what the word radical actually means, is to go to the root of something, you have to look at the human system. The human system is older than any of the other systems that people point to. It's older than religion. It's older than other institutions that we try to counter. It's the human system from which all of these other systems emerged. And just think of the limbic system, the reptilian fight or flight or freeze system that we all carry in our brains. It's millions of years old, right? That's what we're contending with. So again, there's a humility that needs to be present in how we talk about coming up with solutions. But there's also excitement in that, like, the problem lies in the human, but the solution lies in the human as well.
What you just said reminds me of a couple of quotes from James Baldwin in his conversation with, and I know you love this conversation, Nikki Giovanni. At one point he says, quote, "It's not the world that was my oppressor, because what the world does to you, if the world does it to you long enough and effectively enough, you begin to do to yourself. You become a collaborator, an accomplice of your own murderers, because you believe the same things they do," end quote. And then later on, he says to Nikki directly, coming from a different generation, I think they were about 20 years apart, he says to her, quote, "You have somehow to begin to break out of all of that and try to become yourself. It's hard for anybody, but it's very hard if you're born black in a white society. Hard because you've got to divorce yourself from the standards of that society. The danger of your generation, if I may say so, is to substitute one romanticism for another, because these categories, to put it simply, but with a certain brutal truth, these categories are commercial categories," end quote. And it feels like one of the struggles that we are going through today, and a struggle, I was going to say I'm more sympathetic to this struggle than the one that you described with the white supremacist, but if I'm being honest, I'm equally sympathetic to his struggle as well, because it's a struggle born out of pain, even if it is not systemic. But I think that there seems to be something similar happening, and I'm like, I can feel myself tensing up as I'm about to say this, but I've got to say it. I feel like we are trafficking a lot these days in a kind of racial pride for certain groups of people. And I understand the intention of that, and I understand that it's born out of good intentions. Is it possible to divorce pride from supremacy, or does one naturally cascade into the next?
Oh, that's an interesting question. Does pride naturally cascade into supremacy? I'm reminded of Uncle Iroh in Avatar: The Last Airbender, who, if you haven't seen this, you must watch it. But so he basically accuses his nephew of being ashamed, and his nephew's like, "I'm not ashamed. I have pride." And then he goes, "Pride is not the absence of shame, but its source." So there's a way in which we hear the word pride and we just think, you're proud to be who you are. But there's another sort of way in which pride is an ego reflex. And what do I mean by ego reflex? I didn't understand precisely what I meant by this until very recently. Ego reflex is when I become way too attached to what I think I am, right? As opposed to an understanding that as a human being, I'm this constantly changing, constantly morphing, constantly transforming being. That's what it means to be a being. And pride or ego is when you over-identify, I would say, with any one aspect of who you are. I'm a fan of psychedelics, and I think that psychedelics has the power to not only introduce more people to these types of conversations, but also perhaps expedite us reaching better solutions to the problems we face. And one of the things that happens whenever you take psychedelics, whether it's shrooms or LSD, let's say, some of the visuals that come out of that is you see the constantly changing nature of all things, the constantly coming and going of all things. This is also something that's, super reflected in, again, Eastern mysticism, which I'm drawn to these days. And I would say pride is an inability to apprehend that truth, the truth of reality itself, which is that we are constantly changing, constantly. And if we are tense and not able to surrender to that fact, then of course it will produce supremacy. It must produce supremacy in order to defend that misapprehension of reality. Does that make sense?
Maybe. I'm with you regarding the transformative power of psychedelics.
Yeah.
Mushrooms did for me what years of therapy and SSRIs could not. But let's take it to a clip that you recently posted from a conversation you had with Coleman Hughes, Camille Foster and David Bernstein, because I think it's related. The core of what I'm trying to get to here is I feel like human beings universally have a need to be part of a group, whether that's a religious group, a racial group, an ethnic group, whatever it is. We are social beings. No man is an island. We feel a deep need, regardless of how introverted you are. We all feel a need to be part of a community larger than ourselves. And you said in this conversation on Coleman's podcast, quote, "There is no world in which we automatically get to a deracialized society, and all of a sudden this politicking thing that we do, where we use identity to gain power, sort of ceases to exist. That's never going to happen. That's built into the fabric of what it means to be human," end quote. And I agree. I agree with that. My question is, does that therefore mean we'll never be free from the concept of race?
It's a good question. I think that the concept and the construct of race emerges out of theological constructs in Europe that are in relationship to darkness and light. And I think that the construct of race emerges out of a particularly uniquely Western, let's say, religious framework, which is certain elements of Christianity, right? And Christianity's interest in, and I'm generalizing, I grew up Christian, so I think I have a right to do that. But Christianity's like interest in obsession with this concept of light and darkness, and its association of light with goodness and beauty and truth, and the association of darkness with evil and with corruptibility and impurity. It is out of that paradigm that the constructs of race emerge. And so in order to dispense with that is deep in the bowels of the American psyche, because it's deep within the bowels of European psyche. And it's not to say that Europe exclusively perceives darkness and light in this way. I'm sure there are plenty of other cultures that perceive darkness and light in this way, or certainly have historically perceived darkness and light in this way. It's manifested differently, but similarly. So because of that, I think it is going to be very difficult to completely dispense with race. I think it is more likely that we will come to a point in time where we take racial categories less sincerely. And I think that is perhaps the best we can hope for. And I don't think that there's anything wrong with that, because I come from the school of Carl Jung, and Carl Jung's work, famous psychiatrist from the 20th century, right? At least in part, it's about shadow work. It's about accepting one's shadows, accepting one's, let's say, negative tendencies and positive tendencies, accepting one's capacity for anger, accepting one's capacity for rage, accepting one's capacity to become a supremacist, to take it to the extreme. Because the more that you accept it, the less it will have a hold on you. This also points to why I'm not let's get rid of race or let's deracialize personally, because I'm more of the school of thought that says, let's accept that all these tendencies exist within us as human beings. Because the quicker we accept that all these tendencies are within us as human beings, the less of a grip those tendencies will have on us. So you can hear Carl Jung's work on shadow work in that, but you can also hear there's a lot of Buddhism in that as well, where acceptance of what we are actually allows some of the things that we are trying to avoid or ban, let's say, or banish, right? That there's a Christian element in that. If we can accept those things will pass. Subtle but very profound difference than simply saying what amounts to let's ban racial categories, which will not actually produce the end that we are trying to seek. I think it's more let's accept that as human beings, we have a tendency to relate to these things in this way. And that acceptance takes practice. So we can accept that those things will have less of a hold on us. We won't need to over-identify with that. And we can still recognize that that's a part of what it means to be human.
I think the best steel manning, or to use a phrase from our mutual friend Angel Eduardo, star manning case for why folks like Camille or Angel in this instance want to abolish race. Having spoke with Angel a lot about this topic, both in his episode of the podcast and also just offline, I think his argument for abolishing it would be probably the same reason he's an atheist, in that he views both religion and race similarly, in that they're both, summing up his words, fake, absurd, and reductionist. They're not real. I relate to that because if you believe something to not be real, and you see a lot of people walking around espousing it as if it is real and challenging you that it is real, and you believe in your heart of hearts, look, It's like the invisible dragon in the garage, right? That famous Carl Sagan analogy, right? There's an invisible dragon in my garage, and any question you throw at me about this invisible dragon, I will have a response that makes it so I do not have to confront the fact that there is no invisible dragon in my garage. And I think for folks like Angel, they see the absurdity of that categorization, being only 400 or so years old, that the project of deracialization is worthy because the original project in and of itself is unfalsifiable and absurd. I mean, 130 years ago or so, racial anthropologists were arguing about how many European races there were. Some saying there were 10, some 4, others 3. We've now seemingly settled on 1. The entire program was flawed in its origins because the researchers were attempting to genetically tie these outward appearances and cultures with personality characteristics. And, most of that pseudoscience has receded from our public discourse, but today we mostly use race as a sort of stand-in for like geographical and cultural heritage. But here's my pushback on it. When I hear folks like Camille Foster or Angel talk about wanting to abolish race, while I believe that it's a worthwhile goal, it would be great if we could do it. My pushback is a bit different from yours, specifically as it applies to African Americans, because while Black as a descriptor given by Europeans to people of African descent was originally meant as a marker of racial inferiority, a quote-unquote stain that its bearers could never escape, a connotation without any culture or meaning of its own outside of its supremacist origins, the people who were marked by it, brought to America enslaved, they formed their own culture over hundreds of years, isolated from their original ones in Africa and often segregated from white society. They developed their own slang, their own traditions, their own music, artwork, food, etc. All obviously, of course, influenced by their living in America, but distinct and unique. So where I think folks like Angel and Camille, why they often get pushback, especially very strong pushback from Black Americans, is because while the origin of Black is bigoted, violent, and exclusionary, out of all of that formed a distinct culture that is uniquely American and a subculture within America. So I think to many people, there is no way to abolish the word Black without negating that history, that culture, despite its problematic etymology.
Yes. And in fact, I think my sort of like suggestion contained in it is this idea that you don't have to abolish it. Again, you can hold it with less, let's say, overburdening weight, but you don't actually need to abolish it. And in fact, out of it can come, and out of it has come, historically speaking, a more transcendent framework. I've heard this quote, out of the particular lies the universal, or through the particular lies the universal. The education that I received attending Langston Hughes Elementary School for the first 4 years of my childhood gave me an education that was rooted in Black identity, but that idea of Black identity was very transcendent. It was always pointing to the transcendent. So this idea that identifying as Black or identifying racially must per se lead to dogma, lead to supremacy, lead to just regressive policies is just not borne out by my own personal historical record.
This is a tough question because I don't even know what the answer to it is myself. Is there a way to form a group without gatekeeping that group? Because for a group to exist, it has to have boundaries. For a restaurant to be a taco spot, it cannot serve burgers, or it ceases to be a taco spot, right? And I think similarly with things like group identity, a much more serious conversation than whether or not a restaurant sells tacos, it feels like to form a group requires discrimination, and not necessarily always in the bad way, but to say, okay, these are the outlines of our religion, or these are the outlines of our culture, these are the outlines of our society, these are the outlines of our government. You must therefore at some point say, hey, I know you want to include this thing. No. I know you want to act this way. No. I know you want to worship this thing. No. And so it seems like a lot of the tension around group identity, in this instance, race, is a grouping cannot exist without a form of policing, but the policing is an inherently harmful part of that group identity. But I don't think those two things are separable. So is there a way to resolve that tension?
You said that the policing is inherently harmful.
Well, I think there's no way for it not to be. Since we're on this topic, let's just take Black identity, right? My belief is that there is no wrong way to be Black because Black is something that you are born as, not something you perform. But I also recognize that there is such a thing as quote unquote Black culture, right? Like we can trace it throughout American society. First, we saw policing most often in white supremacy up until the last few decades. But I think what we see now is either coming from the white majority in a kind of benevolent sort of way where they promote a certain very specific form of quote unquote Blackness. And I spoke about this with Bertrand Cooper, often manifesting itself in working class communities as if that is the most authentic performance of it. But I also see it policed within the quote unquote community itself, where there is a certain way to quote unquote be authentically Black. And I don't know how you resolve that tension, because for an identity to exist, it has to have parameters. But then also it leads to a kind of harmful discrimination if someone steps outside of those boundaries.
So this is interesting. I mean, you said earlier, you referenced James Baldwin's talk with Nikki Giovanni, where he says you have to sort of find a way to be yourself. And Ralph Ellison also explores this in Invisible Man. So to answer your question, I don't think there's a way to resolve it. I don't think there's a way to resolve the tension, but I also think, obviously, policy-wise, you want to create laws that make that tension as less superimposed by the government, let's say, as possible, right? But when it comes to the way people, as people, respond and act towards each other, you can't superimpose anything that would stop that from happening. And at the same time, perhaps this is naive for me to say, but like as someone who grew up in an environment where I was accused of being white because I had an interest in learning about Maya Angelou and poetry of the Black Harlem Renaissance, right? Because I had an interest in, let's say, intellectual ideas coming out of Black cultural history, I was accused by some of my peers as being white. So I understand that tension. I'm not speaking abstractly. I understand the sorrow and pain and suffering that I felt as a result of being accused that way. And at the same time, that paved the way, along with other things that I experienced, for me to craft an identity and to embark on that process that James Baldwin articulated to Nikki Giovanni and that Ralph Ellison articulated in Invisible Man, which is to become my own person. And I actually think that is the outcome. Like what you're describing, those factors that are inherently unresolvable, is precisely the tension, arguably, that is necessary for human beings to become human, to truly become who they are. And there's a great opportunity as a result.
I agree. I have friends who have experienced the same thing, where if they have a passion for reading or they're more of a nerd, and this is not universal. There are many communities that exist in which this is not the case. But I have heard similar stories where someone has been criticized for having a passion for literature or things that are not coded, quote unquote, as Black. And the thing that's tragic about it all is that, again, this is an inheritance of white supremacy. The idea of, getting good grades, et cetera, is quote unquote not a Black thing. It's an inheritance because it is descended from many hundreds of years in which white supremacists said there is no point in teaching Black people how to read. There is no point in educating them. This is not for them. And then through a game of horrific telephone, many hundreds of years later, to go back again to one of those James Baldwin quotes, it's imbibed and absorbed as a part of the culture. But it's a false inheritance. It's one rooted in supremacy and hatred. And it's tragic to see that sort of played out within the community that was initially oppressed, as if though that is the authentic identity.
There's another layer to that, though, which I recently encountered, which perhaps speaks more about discrimination by various European cultures against other European cultures. And this is actually the kernel of truth, I think, that exists within, I don't know if you saw those quote unquote anti-whiteness posters that were coming out in 2020 where they criticize obsession with the written word. One of the reasons why it's funny is one of the great products of Black culture is, of course, hip hop, and hip hop is obsessed with the written word. And, Afeni Shakur, Tupac's mom, literally explicitly said she was obsessed with the written word. But anyway, that's an aside. I think that the deeper kernel of truth in that is that, and this doesn't just apply to Black people, it applies to Europeans as well, is that there has been appreciation of ways of learning and ways of being that are not strictly literal. What I mean by that, and people can look more into this if they would like, I would recommend reading Ian McGilchrist's The Master's Emissary, which talks about different ways of being that are based on oral traditions and embodied traditions, and how a lot of that was lost in certain epochs in European history because of various philosophies that came out of the Enlightenment that, let's say, looked with degradation to the human being as an embodied being and elevated the human being as a being that was able to be, let's say, detached, which inevitably comes through when you're reading. When you're reading something, you are distant from the thing. You're not encountering the actual experience. This is why Socrates, funny enough, said to be very suspicious when it comes to the written word, because the written word was written in a very particular context, in a very particular place, by a very particular person who had a very particular experience. And if you assume that you are taking in and imbibing all the things that that person is taking in just by reading it, you're actually deceiving yourself. There's another book about this called The Spell of the Sensuous by David Abram. And I actually think that part of our problem, part of our inability to solve the problems that we're trying to solve for, comes from our social media apparatuses, and particularly Twitter, I'm thinking about, or X, or whatever you want to call it, where it's just people sending words at each other. It's not actually real. It's not actually people having lived experiences, localized experiences where they're building community, embodied experiences where they're building community, so on and so forth. I'm trying to point out the fact that within Europe itself, historically, there was hierarchy that was created among Europeans themselves, whereby there was this belief that if you engaged with something in a very detached way where you were separate from it, that was somehow superior to an embodied oral culture, which of course exists within European society itself and within European history itself, where you look at Homer's The Odyssey, which was historically chanted, right? It was sung. It was a song. It was a poem that was actually spoken. It wasn't originally that we got a book and we read it. So I think that there's an interesting connection there between this critique of the written word, which is expressed in terrible ways, in ways that aren't actually conducive to anything, in ways that are harmful. And yet embedded in that critique is a deep yearning for embodied ways of being that has been lost in many societies, including European society itself. I don't know if I landed that plane, but I wanted to really try.
No, I hear you. The ways that you speak about these topics, I can feel your upbringing. You grew up in a Christian home that didn't observe Christian holidays. You've said about that upbringing, quote, in a house of people that was very much interested in the origin of things. Instead of observing Christmas by putting up a Christmas tree every December 25th and having gifts, my family spent Christmas reading documents about Emperor Constantine and the Roman Catholic Church and how it transformed ancient Roman cultural holidays into what is now known as Christmas, end quote. And understanding that rather specific, I would say nationally atypical Christian upbringing helps me to make sense of your connection to Judaism. To understand the origins of Christianity, to truly understand them, would mean that you'd have to be deeply knowledgeable about the Jewish faith and its traditions. And you and your family observed Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur and Passover. And it also, to me, Chloé, gives great insight into how you think about a topic like race. Because I think most people never try and get to the origins of it. I think we just take it for granted as a thing that is real and exists. We just talk about it all the time so casually. But I think that your upbringing and that kind of curious obsession with understanding the root of a thing, I think says a lot about how you talk about this issue.
Yeah, it continues to hold a great amount of impact on the way I see things. It informs the way I see things. And it's, I know I talked about psychedelics, but I describe my upbringing as a very psychedelic upbringing in the sense that I have a very insider-outsider relationship with all these traditions. Christianity, Catholicism, Judaism, it's always coming and going. It's never this static thing. And of course, as a child observing Christianity in the way that I observed it and attending the church that I attended, I definitely saw it as a static thing. I definitely over-identified with it as a marker that made me uniquely Christian in contrast to those other Christians who don't know what they're doing. There's definitely that side of it too. But now that I am older and can be more reflective about the way I was raised, I can see how the constant grappling with where a thing came from, where a tradition came from, how it was informed, that's the paradigm through which I see many things. And I had to come to grips with the fact that that was a very unique upbringing and most people were not raised to grapple in that way. But I think like there's a way in which grappling becomes dance if you can surrender. That's the orientation that I try to bring to all these topics. And that's why I said what I said on that podcast with Coleman and the others. It's like, I'm not trying to get to a place where we try to banish things. I think that that is part of the problem. To be averse to something is a form of clinging in Buddhism. And it's like, I don't want to be averse to it because if I'm averse to it, I will actually ruminate on it and start to over-identify with it. If I can hold it lightly, if I can take it sincerely, but take it less seriously, then I will see how it morphs and changes form and comes in and goes out and goes out and comes in, as is the nature of all things.
Yes. The problem with ever trying to abolish something or to ban it or to silence it is that you can never truly eradicate it. You can never eradicate an idea. An idea is not like a species or an infectious disease. Like it can be driven underground. And the problem with driving it underground is oftentimes it festers and grows at a quicker pace than it would have had it been given air to breathe. Yeah, that's the tricky thing. You said in our first conversation all the way back in January of 2021, there was this phrase that stuck out to me as I was listening back to it. You said, quote, "You can either grow out of religion or grow your religion." And I guess I just wanted you to speak a little bit more on that, what that means to you today.
Yeah, so that quote comes from a rabbi named Micah Goodman. I very much identify with, like I said, Eastern wisdom traditions. I have a Taoist tattoo. I have a daily morning ritual that is very much rooted in yoga chakra system, the oldest yoga, actually, which is not the embodied postures or the stretches that we know of today, which are, I think, only 500 years old. The oldest yoga is chanting, actually. So I think it's also ironic that I fell into that since the name of my company is called The Theory of Enchantment. But I gravitate towards that. I meditate on a lot of Buddhism and Taoist teachings. And as someone who started out at a very conservative Christian home, who then had an existential crisis in senior year in college, where someone who was a agnostic, liberal professor showed up with a kind of love that reflected the love that Jesus embodied, that existential crisis was the awakening that I needed to expand my sense of religion. And I never really went to the atheistic route, in the sense that, like, I never believed in, this is how my brain interprets atheism. I never went to a place where I denied the existence of the transcendent. When I listen to Richard Dawkins, I hear a denial of the transcendent, or I hear a reduction of the transcendent to, like, I don't know, the material. That never resonated with me. But I certainly suffered from depression, anxiety, melancholy during that existential crisis. And I'm grateful for it in retrospect, but it was very hard. It was very, very hard to grapple with and very, very hard to deal with. I'm grateful for the place that I've come to. And I understand why people are hesitant to grapple with complexity in general, because if you look at, like, the caterpillar becoming a butterfly and the caterpillar having to go through that very grueling process of becoming a butterfly, like, it's actually a very grueling process to transition from a person who believes in a very dogmatic black and white state to one who can painstakingly see the complexity in reality itself. And it also takes practice, a daily effort and discipline to be able to arrive at that state. I understand why people aren't so jolly about doing that, or like embarking on that, or taking that up as a project. And at the same time, I will say that butterflies are so beautiful, and it's really been a joy to continue to try to arrive and to successfully arrive at a place of gratitude. And gratitude, that word is related to the word grace, right? These words are interrelated. So I would say to arrive at a state of grace, to pay homage to my Christian ancestors, right? To arrive at a state of grace is really what comes out of moving from a place of black or white thinking to a place of complexity. You arrive at a state of grace by being able to see the complexity in everything, the diversity in everything. You give thanks for it. You give thanks for the miracle of being alive, for the miracle of getting to participate in this wild and wondrous life, and to contribute a verse, as Walt Whitman said. And I wouldn't want any other thing. So I'm grateful for arriving here, and I am humbled by the process that it took me to get here, and many more awakenings I'm sure I will encounter and go through. And I'm happy to be at a state where I'm building a company that's helping other people make that same move that I made or started to make as a senior in university.
It's apt that you chose the caterpillar analogy, because I actually just recently learned this, I think last week. For a caterpillar to become a butterfly involves complete destruction of the self.
Yeah.
If you were to cut open a cocoon at just the right time, caterpillar soup would pour out of the cocoon. The caterpillar is completely destroyed by itself, and the butterfly is basically a new being, totally, almost wholly separate from the initial caterpillar. You know, you have Theory of Enchantment, which is aiming to do a healthier, more holistic take on what has too often been a very reductionist, harmful approach to DEI. But if thinking about these issues of race and identity and belonging and togetherness and unity, is it an inherently painful process, or is there a way to do it at scale that does not require the complete dissolution of the caterpillar?
You know what they say, no pain, no gain. Ram Dass was a beautiful meditator, thinker in the 60s, and he said that the place that we want to get to is where we start to realize that suffering is grace. And suffering, the word suffer, its original meaning actually means to allow, right? To allow for something. Human beings, one of the things that makes us human is the fact that we experience pain, that we experience suffering. And that isn't to say that the only thing we experience is suffering. The only thing we experience is pain. And I would also say that, like, there's already so much pain and suffering being experienced and compounded upon by not making this move. I would say that this path that I am speaking of is actually far less suffering intensive compared to the one that is encapsulated in the mainstream DEI world. So in that sense, it's actually less suffering. It's actually less pain. And there is a kind of just pain point that exists when you're moving from a space where you thought the world works according to a certain set of rules, and it actually doesn't. But I would say beyond that pain, beyond that suffering, is a great deal of joy. And James Baldwin said in The Fire Next Time, once we get to that state of joy, once we're able to respond from that state of joy and be in that state of joy, all of our problems, at least in terms of race, will be solved. Because ultimately what we're talking about, the problem at least, is an inability to give thanks for everything that we encounter. The way in which our brains are conditioned to behave, at least in our society, is to constantly be seeking praise from others and constantly be moving away from being blamed by others, or constantly seeing how we can win and constantly seeing how we can avoid loss. That's a lot of mental chatter. We're constantly on the hunt for like fame or popularity and trying to prove to ourselves that we're significant. That's a lot of mental chatter. That's a lot of mental energy. And if we can move from that to a place where we're simply being present, does it take a lot of work? Yes. But once we're there, there's so much joy. There's so much gratitude. There's so much healing that comes out of that, that the pain is actually worth it, because we know that the place that we're getting to is a place where we can give thanks for everything as it comes and as it goes. That would be my offering to that question. It's a great question. There is pain that comes out of it, but that pain is in and of itself part of the process. Albert Murray talks about the blues, this beautiful creation that came out of the history of slavery, the history of Jim Crow. And he says that the blues is about love, because by singing the blues, you get rid of the blues as such. So you could ask me, like, is there a lot of pain and suffering in the blues? Well, it's like, yeah, it's the blues. You're singing about your sorrow. You're singing your sorrow, but to sing your sorrow is actually to get rid of it. And that's what I'm suggesting, is that once we can get to a place where we are able to be with everything as it arises, including the things that we've suffered, then what we have suffered will change. But it takes a great deal of faith to be able to surrender to that fact.
It feels like what you experienced from that college teacher is a form of agape love, something we spoke about in our last conversation. For our listeners, agape is a word from ancient Greek, denoting familial or spousal affection without a romantic or sexual connotation, separate from eros, which describes sensual passion, and philia, which connoted strong friendship. Christians often use it to mean the love of God for man and the love of man for God. So my final question to you, Chloé, is how in this moment, looking back at the last 4 years of turmoil, strife, and division, as we potentially emerge from that fever I referenced at the beginning of this conversation, how can we practice agape love for each other?
It was an example of agape love, or unconditional love, love without conditions, love not based on conditions, right? Again, it's related to being able to give thanks for everything as it comes. I would say, believe it or not, one of the ways you could learn how to start modeling agape love is to limit your time on social media. Social media is conditioned to get us into a fight or flight brain, which takes us out of the present moment. And agape love requires presence, because by directing agape love to another human being, you are giving them your attention. You are attending to them. That is a gardening word, that word, attention, attending, or tending. And if you're constantly distracted by social media, which is designed to distract you with things that will make you outraged, because if you are outraged, you're more likely to pay attention, then you're already starting off on poor footing. So be very intentional about how much time you spend on social media. We shape it and it shapes us. I would recommend limiting to no more than 90 minutes a day, and fill the rest of your time with paying attention to or attending to the people in your community, reaching out to them, being very curious with your family and friends about what's going on for them, actively listening to them, which is a skill set that is in short supply these days, again, because of the huge weight and the pull that social media has on us. So I think really clearing space by limiting your time on the platforms and replacing that time just by being in relationship with others is a really healthy way to start seeding your way of being, yourself and your community with that kind of agape love.
Chloé, having followed you for about 5 years now, maybe 6, it's all a little bit hazy pre-pandemic. There are a few things that I truly admire about you. Your curiosity is infectious, your eloquence when speaking on these topics. And if this is not too presumptuous to say, you strike me as someone who has a truly good heart, a heart for other people, a heart for understanding people who are too often misunderstood, sometimes intentionally misunderstood by bad actors. And you approach these really complex and often contentious topics with nuance, but more importantly, with empathy. So I'm deeply appreciative of what you're doing, Chloé, both in your work with Theory of Enchantment, but also just your work out in the public, going on podcasts, having these difficult conversations, challenging, I think, these deeply embedded and often poisonous ideas around identity with a truly unique perspective born out of your own upbringing. Chloé, thank you so much for your work. And today, most of all, thank you for your time.
Thank you, Michael. I appreciate you.